Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, August 23rd, 2019, and today we're just going to be discussing the argument against polling data. And number one, I am not advocating for the argument against it. I'm pretty much rebutting it, considering that a number of comments that I see on almost all of my videos pretty much discredit polls because of the 2016 presidential election. Today I'm going to be running through the midterm and presidential elections and comparing the polling numbers versus the actual results since the year 2002. And it does hold some pretty interesting results. Now, if we're talking about the overall, majority of polls, yes, some of them do fluctuate. On your screen right now, we see a bunch of Colorado and Nevada, Trump versus various Democrat polls, and yes, these numbers may not exactly be absolute as they stand today, a year and a half out of the election, but as we get towards the election, polling numbers definitely become a lot more accurate. There's this huge myth back in 2016 that the polling numbers predicted a landslide Hillary Clinton victory, when in reality it predicted a 272 to 266 victory for Secretary Clinton, with her losing the state of Nevada, which she indeed won back in 2016. The only states that were wrong in 2016 were Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Though those three states were crucial to Trump's victory back in 2016, they were the only states that were incorrectly viewed for Hillary Clinton. Ohio, Iowa, a number of states, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, the list goes on, Arizona, Texas, all these quote-unquote toss-up states were projected to go to Trump ahead of time. These are states that are already on the no toss-up map, which pretty much takes the polling average and gives it to each candidate that is currently ahead of the other one, and it showed Trump with 266 electoral votes. Though the mainstream media may have had different maps, the 2016 polling numbers were not that far off. We're going to go ahead and take a look at the 2002 House election midterm results because they do hold some pretty interesting results, and that's where we're starting off right at the beginning of the century. So 2002 was pretty much a year actually right after 9/11. This was a year that the Republican Party was in office with George Bush, and they actually won seats. Now, this was mainly based off the high approval rating of the president and the overall polarized nature of the entire United States, and 2002 was just a really good year for the Republican Party. But back in 2002, there was a national average of the Republicans up by 1.7% nationwide, and they gained 8 seats. It's not a substantial gain, but it's something that pushed them over from being a narrow majority to a pretty a little bit larger of a majority. So 2002 wasn't exactly a super good year for the GOP, but definitely a good year for midterms considering they lost no seats in the House of Representatives. Republicans led 1.7% nationwide on polling data, ended up with a lead of 4.6% nationwide. Midterm elections back then, polling data wasn't as accurate as it is now, as you'll see as we go up, even though that may be unbelievable. The data proves it. Republicans gained 8 seats in the United States House of Representatives based off that. So let's go ahead and take a look at 2006. This was the first year that Nancy Pelosi became Speaker of the House, and it was a year that the Democratic Party picked up the Senate and the House of Representatives majority. They gained 31 seats with an overall average of 11.5% nationwide. They ended up only winning by 7.9% nationwide, but they did gain 31 seats. This is a pretty general indicator that this generic ballot tends to show true when it comes down to the gained seats versus lost seats for the opposition party. Let's go ahead and take a look at 2010 because that is a year that the Republican Party did phenomenal in the United States House. They did not win the Senate, but this was a year that was absolutely amazing for the GOP. They gained 63 seats at a Republican plus 9.8 lead nationwide on the generic ballot. They ended up only winning by 6.7%, so something that's pretty different here is that the polling numbers may be off by 2 to 3% in terms of the generic ballot, but generally when we're looking at the pickups, they reflect what we saw on the polling data. And also, a lot of these numbers actually favor the Democratic Party sometimes and the Republican Party other times. As you saw in 2002, the polling data was a little bit worse for Republicans than the actual result compared to 2010, where they didn't win by 9.8% nationwide, but they still picked up 63 seats, flipping it from pretty much an amazing large majority for the Democratic Party to an even bigger majority, not even bigger majority than the Democrats, but than what the Democrats have now in the House of Representatives for the GOP in 2010. That was a really, really good year for them. Let's move on to 2014, another House election year. There's House election year every 2 years. It makes sense. It's a midterm year, though. And the House majority was expected to go to the Republicans by 2.4% in terms of the overall vote, and it ended up going by 5.7%. Again, this polling data was actually not too good for the GOP and actually favored them a little bit better. So we see differences like that. And they picked up 13 seats in the House of Representatives. So, again, something that we saw that was pretty interesting. 2014 was another good year for the Republicans, considering Barack Obama was back in office. But let's hit 2018, the most recent House of Representatives elections in which Nancy Pelosi is back in as Speaker of the House, and the Democratic Party gained 41 seats. The overall average actually had the Democrats at 7.3% nationwide. They ended up winning by 8.4%. So the polling data actually favored the Republicans a little bit more in our most recent election, which a lot of people don't recognize. 41 seats gained for the Democratic Party. This polling data always matches up with the gaining party, but that's not too hard. Let's hit the Senate election starting back in 2006. 2006 was a year that the Democratic Party gained the United States Senate, as I mentioned before, but the numbers were exactly right. 51 to 49. There were one independent and one Connecticut for Lieberman, which actually 2006, this year, it went to the Democratic Party because they both caucused with the Democrats, though it shows 49 there. The two independents pretty much, or two third parties actually, pushed the Democrats over the top at 51 to 49. So they actually won back the United States Senate, but the polling numbers were exactly correct. Let's go ahead and take a look at 2010 because that was a year that was really good for the GOP, yet the Senate still retained for the Democratic Party. The Senate had an exact number correct in terms of the polling data. They predicted it correctly at a 53 to 47 majority nationwide, and all of the pickups were accurately predicted by the Real Clear Politics polling averages, which definitely shows good numbers for the GOP here. 2014 Senate elections roll around, and the only two states that were wrong were Kansas and North Carolina. If we look here, Kansas actually had an independent running, not a Democrat. It was expected to go to the independent, ended up not going, and then North Carolina was expected to retain for the incumbent Democrat. That did not end up going as well. So that was a gain in North Carolina for the GOP, and Kansas went to the GOP, and it was not an independent victory. The United States Senate went to the GOP 54 to 46 at the end of this. And 2018, we have Senate elections here, our most recent Senate elections, and there were three states that were wrong. The state of Arizona, which was expected to go to the GOP by 1%, ended up going to Kirsten Sinema by 2.3%. The state of Florida was expected to go to the Democrats, and Rick Scott ended up winning. And in the state of Indiana, Joe Donnelly was expected to win here, and he ended up losing. So there were three states wrong in the United States Senate, but generally this data was correct. Now, I'm talking about midterm elections here. Let's go ahead and take a look at the presidential election. So actually on the screen right now, I do not have the 2004 presidential election map. I'm pretty sure I can just pick it up if I go ahead and just go back one. But looking at this was actually a pretty good sweep for George Bush. If we saw a map like this, we'd pretty much call it a Red Sea. But the only state that was actually incorrectly predicted by polling data was the state of Wisconsin. It was expected to go to George Bush by less than a percentage and ended up going to John Kerry by an even narrower margin. But the state of Wisconsin was expected to go to George Bush and ended up not going for him. But that's pretty much the only wrong state back in 2004. On the presidential level, again, in 2008, there was only one wrong state yet again. The state of Indiana, which narrowly went to Obama, one of the first Democrats to win here in an extremely long time and one of the last for a really long time, unless something changes. But Indiana went to Obama, and that was the only state that was not accurately predicted by the RCP average. 2012 rolls around, and we have only one state that was inaccurately predicted by polling data, and that is the state of Florida. What's been consistent is that we've seen very minimal, I guess, mess ups between the polling data and the actual results. And if we're looking at it, Florida was wrong in 2012, sure, but that's one state out of 50. 2008, Indiana was wrong, again, one state out of 50. And 2004, one state was wrong, the state of Wisconsin, one state out of 50. This polling data is pretty accurate, to be completely honest with you. If we're looking at the swing states, they accurately predicted Obama's victory in Ohio, in Iowa, in New Hampshire, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. The only state that they were wrong in was in the state of Florida. And in fact, the polling data favored the Republican Party even more in 2012 than the actual results. So polling data, I definitely don't see the argument about it skewing left. I don't necessarily agree with that, especially since I look at this data so often. This data tends to stay unbiased. And in 2016, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were expected to go to Hillary Clinton, all of which, keep in mind, were decided by less than 1%. So it wasn't exactly a blowout for Trump, and it wasn't exactly predicted to be a blowout for Hillary Clinton either. The state of Nevada was expected to go to Trump, but typically in the state of Nevada, they overestimate Republicans. Back in 2018, there was a time where Dean Heller led in the Senate race. It ended up being a narrow Jackie Rosen victory in terms of the polling data, but he was leading for a very, very long time and ended up not even coming close in comparison to a number of other Republican senators. So looking at that, that's pretty much the presidential election map. But the 2018 generic congressional vote is something I want to point out. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the Republican Party did not have a good year in 2018. There were a number of people on my channel, considering I created this back in 2017, saying that I was wrong. The polling data was wrong. The Republican Party was going to retain the House of Representatives, but they ended up losing 41 seats on that night. And it does not look good for them, especially since this data has become increasingly more accurate. We may see a little bit off of the trend's a little bit off in the presidential election, sure, but that's pretty much expected. Those states were decided by less than 1%, but in this generic congressional vote, the Democratic Party was actually underestimated. That is not a good sign for the GOP whatsoever. And in fact, I always point this out. Rasmussen Reports typically favors the GOP. Every single poll on here in the most recent 2018, polling data shows the Democrats ahead by 7% or 5% actually, or more. But there is one polling firm that continues to stick out as being wrong, and it shows the Republicans ahead by 1% nationwide. Rasmussen Reports typically favors the GOP and Trump voters, and that's one reason why Trump continues to use it, referring to his approval rating. Whenever they show him at 50% and the nation shows him at 44%, there's a reason why he's flocking to them, and there's a reason why it showed the Republicans ahead by 1% when every other poll taken in recorded history in the 2018 midterm elections showed the Democrats ahead. Rasmussen Reports was consistently wrong and consistently off compared to the rest of the data. There is not a single poll on here that shows the Republicans ahead up until we hit the Rasmussen Reports poll that ended up being wrong by 9.4% in terms of the national average. So forgive me when I attack some pollsters for being historically inaccurate, but generally polling data is accurate in terms of the overall predicted results versus the actual results on election day. So when I look at this data and I'm bringing it up, I hate seeing comments that, not hate is a strong word, strongly dislike seeing comments where people are discrediting my opinion or how I am analyzing the election just because I'm using polling data from Emerson, from Gravis, for even OH Predictive Insights, which I recently got a lot of backlash for putting on my Instagram story for this Arizona poll. But generally this polling data isn't too far off, and I will continue to use this. I am not going to just completely ignore it because part of my audience does not want it. I understand that some of you may not agree with what the polling results are saying, but that's no reason to ignore them. You can't cherry pick polling results and say just because Trump is doing better in one poll or the Democrats are doing better in one poll that you can trust that one over the other. That's just not how it works. Generally, these polls are pretty accurate, and if RCP puts them out, I generally trust them. 538 goes even further and adjusts them. But until I completely adjust to 538, which I'm probably going to in the upcoming month because they do a lot more work than RCB in terms of investigating polls. Generally, they show the same averages, but they just show and rate the certain pollsters. But generally, these polls aren't too far off. As history has shown, Real Clear Politics will continue to be accurate, and I will continue to use them as a reliable source of information for upcoming elections and helping me predict them. So thank you guys for watching this video. Comment down suggestions below, and I will see you all tomorrow.